Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Darna Noor, joining you here in Baltimore. This past weekend, Mexican police forces shot and killed at least 8 teachers and 1 journalist in the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca. The police struck down as teachers blocked a highway in protest against the national government's neoliberal education reform. The new reform would institute teacher evaluations, which some say would lead to the dismissal of thousands of teachers and the hiring of underqualified ones. This is not the first time that teachers in Oaxaca have faced state repression. The region has had a long history of standing up to the central government. So with us to discuss these recent events is Laura Carlson. Laura is the director of the Americas program at the Center for International Policy in Mexico City. She focuses on U.S. policy in Latin America and grassroots movements in the region. Thanks so much for joining us again, Laura.
Thanks, Darna, for the invitation.
So, okay, some background. What are the teachers protesting against exactly? Initial reports are saying that this is mainly about their opposition to the national teacher exams, these new evaluations. But is that really what this is about, or is there more to it?
There's much more to it. They're protesting the educational reform, which is part of a package of structural reforms that were pushed through Congress by the government of Enrique Peña Nieto. These reforms are kind of the nail in the coffin of the neoliberal model, which has been applied to extremes here in Mexico with disastrous results. So the reform does cover evaluations. They create this huge institute for evaluations. It's a standard evaluation, and the reform was actually designed by the Organization for Economic Development Corporation and by the private sector here in Mexico with the help of the Inter-American Dialogue and a number of organizations on an international level that really represent the imposition of this neoliberal model. What it does is it really breaks down one of the largest unions in the hemisphere, which is the Education Workers Union here in Mexico. And it's really been called an educational reform, but when you look at the specifics of it, it's far more a labor reform, a labor counter-reform, because what it does is it rolls back a lot of the historical conquests of the education workers over the past decades. And it essentially strips them of their right to representation and a number, even the right to hold their jobs and to have a fair hearing in terms of their dismissals. That's where the evaluations come in. The top-down evaluation, which is just a standard kind of a template evaluation, doesn't take into account that the teachers are working in very diverse conditions. There's an educational crisis, but it has to do with the fact that there's over 5 million illiterate people in Mexico. There's a 30% of schools that don't have things as basic as a building or running water or sewage or bathrooms. They're working under conditions that are really impossible, so the application of evaluation that's one size fits all in these conditions in communities where many of the people don't even speak Spanish, is a recipe for an arbitrary firing of a number of teachers, especially the ones who are working in the most difficult situation. So they're defending probably what is the biggest neoliberal strike against the right to unionize and to organize for labor protections and labor rights in the hemisphere in the last 4 decades.
And as I was saying before, this isn't the first time that we've heard about this union engaging in teacher strikes in Oaxaca. There were teacher strikes in 2006 that got a lot of press, in 2013, 14, 15. Can you talk more about the history here and what the trajectory has sort of been?
Yeah, it's important to point out. So we're talking about, as I mentioned, the biggest union in Latin America, the teachers' workers. But that union, as is typical here in Mexico, was historically allied with the ruling party, the PRI, and was controlled by union bosses with very little rank-and-file democracy. So in the early 80s, the Coordinadora of Education Workers, or the association, was formed as a democratic current within that union. So when we see the mobilizations today against the neoliberal reforms, what we're seeing is the resurgence of that democratic current within the teachers' union. They have historically held on to and won the elections to represent the teachers in a number of states, especially Oaxaca, for many, many years now. And that's where we're seeing the most intense mobilizations. But what's interesting about this resurgence in the context of a reform that strikes at the rights of all education workers, even many who traditionally weren't forming part of the democratic current, is that we're beginning to see mobilizations all through the country. And not only that, we're beginning to see that there is, and this has been true historically as well, that there's a lot of support from other sectors of the society. There's always been a lot of protest against these structural reforms, one of which was the privatization of the oil industry, which is a real flashpoint for Mexican nationalism. And so the teachers in these mobilizations and in the resistance to education reform are bringing together a lot of discontent that's been brewing in Mexican society, especially under the government of Peña Nieto, for a long time. This latest mobilization and the massacre at Nochixtlan happened almost exactly 10 years after the 2006 uprising of teachers, and not just teachers, but all of Oaxacan society practically, after a similar act of repression when the state government forcibly evicted the teachers from the Central Plaza. That uprising lasted for months, led to the deaths of the assassination of some 26 professors, of some 26 education workers, and the U.S. journalist Brad Will. So there is a long history there. It's always been a lightning rod for a general discontent within society, not just of the neoliberal reforms, but also with these kinds of repressive responses of government and the authoritarian nature of Mexican federal and state governments.
And can you talk a bit more about that state reaction? Why is the state reacting so violently? There's been these 8 or 9 who have been killed, but then hundreds others have been injured. Shooting and killing teachers seems to be one of the most extreme reactions possible. So what's going on?
Absolutely, and I think they crossed a line, and it would be very difficult for them to maintain any type of an image of just a reformer. It's clearly a crackdown on the teachers, a violent crackdown that's worthy of some of the most authoritarian dictatorships that we've seen throughout Latin America. And I think this has revealed the true nature of the Peña Nieto government, which is one of the most interesting things and tragic things about it. And unfortunately, we're likely to see more of that kind of response. So why would they go to such extreme measures in the case of a teachers' uprising? A teachers' uprising, teachers who traditionally, and in this case, have a great deal of sympathy among the general population because of their sacrifices to educate young people, which is something that families and citizens throughout the country feel very strongly about. And the reason is that they have a lot at stake here. If the teachers succeed in renegotiating and in setting back this privatization, neoliberal education reform, then it could and should open up a lot of public debate on the other reforms that were never sufficiently debated within Mexican society when they were passed, and that have caused a lot of opposition, but that never got to the point where they were able to block it in a pre-controlled Congress. So they're afraid that the teachers are setting a bad example for a population that they need to control right now, that they need to control in order to impose a very unpopular economic model, not just evaluations. It goes way beyond that. It has to do with this whole package of structural reforms. And that if the teachers are successful in bringing together other sectors of society and creating a model where these reforms are opened up and actually debated in society to see if there's a consensus on them or not, then their whole plan of imposition will fall apart. And that's why the government has chosen repression.
Okay, we're going to pick this up in part 2. Thanks so much for joining us, Laura, and thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.